made the South very familiar to me. And it also gave it this narrative feel. It's almost like a soundtrack. So even in Alabama from the start, it was like I'd been provided a soundtrack, whether it was the blues or country or bluegrass or whatever. That was very important.
Julyan Davis. I had the good fortune of getting an opportunity to sit down with Julyan last year in December. He's a new friend of mine, relatively new friend, who I met through Brian Mashburn, the producer of the show, who also introduced me to Daniel Nevins, our first artist guest, back in episode 2. And so now we have another artist, Julyan Davis. Again, he's a painter, and you can see his work at julyandavis.com. He's got a great website. Encourage you to check it out. And he's represented locally here in Asheville by the Blue Spiral Gallery. And he's one of a number of visual artists here in Asheville. We're very fortunate to have an active painting community here. And Julyan's interesting because he has been painting the American South here for 25 years. His paintings are, again, just lovely and fascinating. And he has an eye for the elements of detail that may get overlooked when it comes to rural, rustic settings. He's good at capturing the elements of the South that are in decay, but also in capturing the mysterious vitality that underlines this region. And he's got the unique vantage point of having grown up in England. So he's able to see the South from originally an outsider's perspective, but he's been here for 25 years now. He came over about 25 years ago and basically has been here ever since. And his most recent works have been in a series of paintings that he calls murder ballads, which capture some dark scenes in the American South, but again, they're like Flannery O'Connor stories or other stories of the Southern Gothic where there's a powerful narrative element driving it. And so I was interested in having a conversation with Julyan to try to connect with how we find the healing element from work in the shadow side, the dark side. And it's a very interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy it. He gets into his personal life and he shares the healing story that he's experienced through the tragic loss of his father many years ago. And he talks about how family legacy shapes us, how it shaped him, the legacy of his father and grandfather, and how he's found a healing path through that. And how he's found a home here in Asheville. I hope you enjoy his story where he shares that he came over carrying an old-fashioned suitcase, the kind without rollers. So he has an appreciation for some of the subtler elements of human life and material life and how it connects us to our deeper emotions. It's a really great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, this is my conversation with the artist Julyan Davis. Here we are now in Asheville.
Yeah,
but it didn't start here, did it?
No, it didn't. No.
Okay, so where are you from?
I'm from London, really. I was born in the West Country, but I spent most of my childhood in London.
Yeah.
And that's where I went to art school.
Uh-huh.
And I suppose my arrival in America was very soon after art school. I'd picked up an old book on the history of Alabama, and I was very intrigued by a particular story about Napoleonic generals and aristocrats who had been exiled from France after Napoleon's defeat and how they ended up in Alabama. And I decided to go on a sort of adventure And so I worked odd jobs for several months, made enough money to get a plane ticket, and came over to Alabama for 3 months. And it ended up being 25 years. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a twist in the story, but very interesting. So, wait, so you picked up a book on Napoleonic generals.
Well, it was a book called Stars Fell on Alabama. And it was written in the 30s by Karl Karma. And it was only one little chapter, actually, on the history of Demopolis. And I just found it so intriguing.
Demopolis is a city in Alabama?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, it's near Selma. And I just found it so intriguing. I thought, it sounded like a sort of Werner Herzog movie.
Yeah.
Sort of crazy
I'm a fan of him.
Idea of these aristocrats in this wilderness. And it was
Fitzcarraldo.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. So I thought that sounded fantastic. And I flew to New York and went to the New York Public Library, and then I went to the Library of Congress, and I was sort of playing at being a writer. I had this. I remember I bought a leather suitcase for my journey that was a vintage suitcase with these wonderful old stickers on it from the 1920s of different Eastern European hotels that have long vanished, and ocean liners and things. And so I put a few clothes in there. This suitcase probably weighed 20 pounds empty, but I put what I could in there, and I was really playing at being a writer, even perhaps more than being an artist. But I'd read a lot of Southern literature, and I was fascinated in the South. So my idea was just to get down to Alabama and spend several months just writing and painting, and it just evolved from there.
So this was following your curiosity about the story of foreign privileged aristocrats venturing into a new territory, the rural Alabama.
It was absolute wilderness. At that time it was
basically just wilderness, yeah.
It was called the Cane Brakes. It was this area of enormous bamboo forests.
Okay.
Pretty impenetrable. They sailed from Philadelphia around to Mobile, which was established at that point, but the rest of it was all Indian territory. It wasn't yet a state, and it was a failed attempt. It was only a few years, and they tried to grow vines and olives. And it was a bit of a fiasco, really. It was a sort of Clouseau-esque thing. They weren't equipped to be farmers. They hired a lot of people to help them. They were cheated by those people. They even built the town twice on land that they hadn't actually bought. So it was a bit of a fiasco, but luckily for them, they were reprieved and allowed to return to France.
What was it about this story that struck you so personally and told you that you had to pick up your life and follow it?
That's a good question, yeah, because I can't recall other people from my art school doing similar things.
Yeah, right.
I think, one thing I had inherited from my father was a fascination with stories and with history. And he was a writer of historical fiction, and I'd grown up listening to a great deal of stories and history. And also, I don't know. It's it's a particularly English thing to find something abroad, to travel, and go on this sort of adventure where you find a story and
Okay.
Yeah.
That's an English thing?
It is rather. I think a lot of English writers travel abroad, travel widely. Graham Greene, people like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the sun never set on the British Empire for a long time.
That's
and
right.
There must have been a lot of folks who explored like that. Okay, so you felt like you were part of this thread too.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And this particular story felt like the one for you.
It did. I mean, actually, the whole book was very interesting.
Okay.
And as I said, the South intrigued me. I think the South, I still find it absolutely fascinating because the history here is so alive. There are threads of history and sentiment that go back a long way, go back to the British Isles, and they really thrive here still. So I find that fascinating.
Yeah. And you said your dad wrote historical fiction.
He did.
What was his period?
He wrote, he was a barrister in London, and his fiction, he had 3 novels published, and they were based on Victorian crime, true crime, and he would fictionalize the events of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think also from my father, I picked up a fascination for that side of things that is quite dark.
Yeah.
And compelling. Yeah. Yeah.
Victorian crime. So I picture the fully developed England in all its splendor with Queen Victoria, and then this underbelly.
Absolutely, yeah. He didn't write about Jack the Ripper.
Okay, right. That's the famous one.
He did write about criminals from that period.
Yeah. A distinct period in time where there's a distinct darkness and shadow side that was emerging.
Yes.
Yeah. It must have been pretty gripping as a young man to read about your father's writing of this. And
yes. Well, it was. He was part of the crime writers group, so he was spending time with people like Agatha Christie and Dick Francis, all these writers. So it was very exciting for him, I think, as a young man.
Yeah. And then you followed along. Now you're a young man in England, and you're inspired by this story, and you've got this history, and here you go to America. You got your suitcase, your vintage suitcase that you were going to carry. And this is 25 years ago, and now we're into vintage things because everything's so disposable and plastic, and we're excited about old vintage things with a character to them. But you were onto this 25 years ago before it was as much of a established obsession, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know where that comes from. I think it might well be that my grandfather, my father's father, had my father when he was quite well into middle age. And there's a generational thing. So my parents were very interested in the culture of their parents' generation. It was very alive to them. So I think it's interesting when I look at people's lives, what we get from our parents. It so much depends on that generational thing. And so I grew up listening to music, that spanned from the 1930s way up into the 60s. And I think I got a great affection for older things. I remember when I was very young, reading all these old books. I mean, not just Sherlock Holmes, but Bulldog Drummond, all these books from the 30s. A friend said to me recently that I was someone who's always been old, and I do like that. I like the idea. I think even as a 11, 12-year-old, I was fascinated by being old, actually. The accoutrements, the clothes, the...
Yeah.
I had peritonitis when I was 11, I think. And so I was hospitalized. My appendix had burst, and I remember really kind of enjoying being a bit of an invalid. I'd just been reading some Sherlock Holmes, so I was wearing a dressing gown, and I sort of enjoyed, hobbling around the hospital room as I got better, and
that there was a story in this.
Yes, I sort of imagined myself as Sherlock Holmes or someone like that. So someone was smoking a pipe or something. So I don't know. The past is very alive in me.
Is it romanticized for you?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I see. No, I don't see the past as something ideal. I wouldn't want to live in the past. But I do find it fascinating the lessons it can teach us and the ways that we continue to ignore the lessons we should learn from it.
Yeah, and the stories from the past when the scale of struggle was so great and you've got man facing the elements and trying to carve a life out of the wilderness.
Yeah.
And, you get to see the successes and failures on such a grand scale. The hero's quest, the mythic story can express itself in full relief against the wilderness, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think what was very helpful for me, it still is that being aware of what people had gone through, not just in the 20th century, but before then, or just reading about all those things, it's to this day, it still gives me a point of reference. I remember when I was an adolescent, I would draw endlessly about the First World War, and my grandfather had been in the First World War, in the trenches, and I remember when I turned 21 actually thinking that I was quite fortunate to be turning 21, because so many people had died in the trenches at 18 or 19, So, I don't know. I think that looking at history has taught me to be, very grateful for what I have.
Yeah. Yeah. And how old were you when you made that jump and to Alabama? Is that where you went first?
Yes, that's right. I was 25.
Uh-huh.
So I was literally just out of art school.
And the plan when you came over here was to write a book.
That was my initial thought, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, so I did all the research, and I think I learned the difficult lesson that many people learn with historical fiction is you need to not get buried under all the research. That's actually something that my father was very good at. He would start his books with the story, and he would do the research as he went along, rather than read extensively before beginning the book. And that's a great way to not get buried by research.
To have the story come out,
that's right.
Emerge from all your work.
Yeah, I think I recall specifically with that, I did enough research to understand how it would have been for those Napoleonic exiles on this side of the Atlantic. And then I started thinking, well, I should read up on Napoleonic France and rural France at that time, and that's when I got completely overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information it seemed I needed to know. So I let that rest, as I say.
Okay.
And it's been nice to come back to it recently and handle it in terms of painting.
So was your father supportive of your efforts to kind of follow in his footsteps like that?
That's a good question. He, I would say when I was in school, he was concerned that as a career choice it would be difficult to be an artist. And that's something I suppose I should say, that, and I don't know, this doesn't apply to every artist, but it's interesting that really from the earliest age, I knew that I was going to be an artist. And my mother particularly was very supportive of that, but all my family really.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
2 sisters, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are they older or younger?
Both younger.
Okay, yeah.
So I'd started drawing when I was 3 or 4, and I was, by the time I was 5 or 6, everyone was saying he's going to be an artist. And I'm realizing now, having a 5-year-old, having a child of my own, that's a huge gift that I had to know from such an early age what I was going to do. I never had that sort of crisis leaving university or high school of thinking, what do I do? Who am I going to be? And that's another thing. I think that not only did I know what I would do for a profession, but my profession really it's sort of who I am. I think they're connected, they're absolutely connected. I don't ever shut off from my day job. It's a 24-hour thing. I am an artist, and so that was an enormous gift. So my father, he was a bit concerned. My mother pushed for me to go to art school.
Okay.
And
you went to art school?
I went to art school in London.
Okay.
And when I graduated, I'm not sure what he thought. I think he certainly would have understood my going off and exploring and that sort of thing. He himself was a great Americanophile and loved the South, loved the West too, particularly.
Had you ever been to America before you came over?
He had taken me when I was he was a magistrate in Hong Kong for 3 years, and so my whole family travelled out there for the last 2 years of high school.
Wow.
And
so you graduated high school in Hong Kong?
I did, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, that was very interesting.
What was that like?
It was fascinating. It was a
English high school.
It was an international high school. It was primarily English. That was wonderful. Yeah. Very exciting. And I found school in England quite constricting, actually. And I think, in fact, returning to England, I didn't have the happiest time going to college in England. So, no, I think that time in Hong Kong was wonderful. And so my father, we had made a trip back to the UK, travelling via the southwest United States. And we'd done a lot of hiking and...
Grand Canyon.
Yeah. All around Arizona and Utah.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful trip. So
yeah. Inspirational.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he had, as I say, I think he had... I'm sure he was interested. I remember him writing a letter to some people in Alabama he knew and saying that my son is coming that way, and if you could look after him or check on him and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, when I returned to England, very, very shortly after that, he killed himself. So I really don't know what he felt about my American sojourn.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. That is a devastating turn. How old were you when this happened?
I would have, I'm still been 25, or 24, 25.
When he committed suicide?
Yes, this would have been 1989.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so I was 24.
24 years old. And was it a shock, of course?
It was a huge shock, I think, to everyone. My father was someone who was very, very driven. An interesting thing for me, again, being a parent now, is to to be aware, to not pass on to my son. There's sort of a family trait there of being driven, of being of expecting in oneself a great deal and being quite self-critical.
Yeah.
Setting very high goals. And my feeling is that he was always in competition with his father, who had been, as I say, in the First World War and had a long military career.
Your grandfather?
My grandfather.
Was in World War I?
He was in World War I, and then in Afghanistan right after that, and then had a long career in India, and had done the war crime trials in Singapore and then at Nuremberg. So his career...
The World War II war crime trials in Nuremberg?
Right. Yeah.
He was involved with that?
He was. He was a brigadier, and he was in the Army Legal Services. So.
So he was involved in those trials?
He was. And I think my father certainly... I think he spent his life trying to live up to his father. And I do remember, for example... him saying to my mother's father that he always wanted, he wished that he had been in a war, that he could have gone to war. He was in the army briefly. Mm-hmm. And I remember being told this by my mother's father, and how he reprimanded my father and said that my grandfather on my mother's side had been in the merchant navy, and he said to my father, how dare you say that? We lost our youth. It was a painful, terrible time. And so my father was driven. I think that's why he wrote. He was something of a Renaissance man. He played the guitar, he wrote, he climbed mountains. Oh, yeah. Yes, he was very driven. I remember as a child, he would devote, great pieces of time to either writing or doing his exercise, going running, playing his guitar. He was always pushing himself. And I think that self-criticism obviously was a part of him committing suicide.
Yeah. The pressure.
Yeah.
The pressure as like a sense of expectation, a sense of destiny, of fulfillment, of, his father was such an important figure on national and global scale, and a sense of contribution to the world. And then a sense of having to fulfill those shoes, maybe?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
What's strange is that, I think anyone looking at my father's life would have said he'd achieved a great deal.
Yeah, right.
He had a successful legal career. He was, a barrister in London, doing major trials, a lot of, big trials, murder, terrorism, armed robbery, exciting stuff, And at the same time, he was off climbing mountains and doing all these things.
Yeah.
But obviously, there were a string of unfortunate events that I think made him particularly self-critical, and I think his feeling of disappointing the expectations of others, led to him making that decision. Mm-hmm. As I say, one of the things I'm trying to be very aware of with my son Finn is to try not to pass that on, because I am aware that in my own life I have been very driven and very self-critical. Mm-hmm. And dissatisfied with myself. Mm-hmm. I think the irony is that same dissatisfaction is what has enabled me to be successful as an artist.
We've kind of talked a little bit about some of the background of you coming to America and what led to that choice and what was driving this pursuit. And you came over to Alabama, and you've been here since.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. So here we're picking things up with your American sojourn, which didn't necessarily... Did you know it was going to be a lifetime? Did you know you were moving in that suitcase?
I did not know.
Okay, right. No. So you were following an artistic pursuit, a career pursuit, and then it just grew and grew.
Yes.
Okay. So when you got over here and began with the research, when did the visual art come into play?
Well, I was painting as well. It was a painting trip also, and right from the start, I was painting. I think really the sort of subject matter that I built a reputation on, which is to paint those parts of the South that were vanishing, were kind of overlooked as being not the right kind of decay, not sort of old, quaint barns and things, but more just old drive-in movie theaters, old rusted buildings. Just a sort of... That fascinated me. I would say that I'd grown up, as I say, in London, but we'd moved to Bath, which is on the outskirts of the Cotswolds. And my entire experience in England had been of a very tidy, pristine place.
Yeah.
And I think what fascinated me about the South, the American South, was this untidiness. I still find it absolutely fascinating. Mm-hmm. In England, people are very aware of what the Joneses next door might think. Everything is kept very neat, very tidy.
Yeah.
And here things sort of spill out. People's yards, they don't seem to have a beginning or an end. Toys are lying around. There's just, it's fascinating because it reveals so much about people.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of what I started painting. And when I moved from Alabama to the mountains, I still continued to paint that sort of thing. I certainly began painting Western North Carolina as well, the mountains and the scenery.
Yeah. When was this?
That would have been in 96.
Okay, so 6-7 years after you got here?
That's right.
Yeah. And you were just traveling around the South?
No. I got married shortly, 1991, to someone I'd met in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah.
And so that enabled me to come and live here.
Well, yeah, it's like any story.
Yeah.
Love keeps it going, right?
Yeah.
Or drives it. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So we moved to Western North Carolina.
Okay. Yeah.
And I lived just outside Highlands in a place called Scaly Mountain.
Oh, okay.
And I bought a little house. And
so you were going for it, the full rural isolation.
I did, yes. I loved that. I really did. I miss it, actually, being here in Asheville. I find it's not quite the same to get in your car and drive for 40 minutes to get to a trail or the wilderness. Right. But there, it was right outside the door.
Yep.
I didn't even have to drive to go for big hikes and, just explore the woods. Yeah.
Okay. So you've been up here for about 20 years, and you've been painting Western North Carolina this whole time.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I go up to Maine in the summers, paint up there a little bit, and I paint most of the South still. I still paint scenes in Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia. But it is primarily Western North Carolina.
Okay. One of the themes of your paintings has been the murder ballads.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Well, let's see. I had grown up listening to all that music. My father played the guitar, as I said.
Yeah.
And I got a very intensive sort of education in folk music just by listening as a little child to everything he was playing, and my first records were all folk music. Mm-hmm. And in there were the murder ballads amongst all sorts.
Like the Harry Smith collection, or you know what I'm talking about? The Smithsonian Harry Smith legendary collection of folk music.
Sometimes I know, actually, like that. Yeah.
But what
I listened
was
to a lot of Lomax, of course, and but it was a variety: Scottish music, Irish, a lot of Irish music, the Dubliners, and a great deal of American folk music.
Yeah.
So that was really important to me because the music has always tied me. As I say, I had read a lot of Southern literature. Faulkner and Welty and McCullers, all these people. But even more than that, the music is what has tied me to the South. I find it very difficult to paint something, even a landscape, that I can't make a sort of historical connection to. And the music, because I'd grown up listening to that music, it made the South very familiar to me. Mm-hmm. And it also gave it this narrative feel. It's almost like a soundtrack. Mm-hmm. So even in Alabama from the start, it was like I'd been provided a soundtrack, whether it was blues or country or bluegrass or whatever. That was very important.
And these stories were told in these old folk songs, these old murder ballads.
Right.
These haunting, just maybe a banjo and a guitar, or, just
that's right.
Old-timey murder ballads, yeah.
Yeah, well, the murder ballads, I had done paintings on and off. In art school, I had done a lot of paintings based on old ballads and sea shanties. All these things I'd grown up listening to.
Yeah.
And I think I don't think people really, I didn't think they had an idea where I was coming from, quite honestly, at art school. I think they felt the work was very odd. So it was always there, that idea of painting the sort of pictures that have a story, that have a certain mystery to them.
A mysterious narrative.
But so it came back when I got to the mountains. I found it fascinating here that places like Madison County, there's such a strong tradition of people keeping these ballads and passing them on generation to generation. And these are extraordinary that, people who have been here 7, 8 generations, they know these huge ballads off by heart that come from the Scottish borders, centuries ago.
Yeah,
and that really excited me, and I thought I would do some paintings based on the ballads, and it sort of lent towards the murder ballads. I would say that I would probably quite a little guilty of choosing that term for the murder ballads to catch people's attention.
Yeah,
I think if I just said I'm doing paintings based on Appalachian ballads and love songs. I think I was being a little canny there.
Yeah.
So I started these paintings for myself, and then the museum in Greenville, South Carolina, they expressed an interest in doing a solo show, and so that gave me the opportunity to really increase the scale of the work.
Yeah.
And they were never done with the idea of being financially viable. They were done for myself and to communicate to people.
Yeah.
And I'd always done that, actually. I've always found in my work very important to have some work that you don't need to sell. You do it for yourself. You find the opportunities to exhibit it. I think that was something I learned moving to the South, because America it does not have as much of a safety net for people like artists. You really do need to make a living. England there may be more grants. There's more ways to,
Yeah.
Here it's quite tough. Alabama is not the first place anyone would think of to go and be an artist.
Yeah.
And so I learned early on to find things that I loved to paint that people also wanted to buy.
Yeah.
And that was
it's a balance.
Very important lesson to learn. So that has always financed me doing work, or my doing work that I can just put under the bed, that I don't need to sell. Now, of course, the murder ballads now, these are very large paintings, so I can't put them under the bed. I have a big studio now, so I store them there, and they've been traveling to different museums, and we do a concert of the ballads with the exhibit, and I give a talk on the history of those. I don't know what it was, but listening to that music when I was a kid, I had got this sort of empathy for particularly sort of the plight of these women caught up in this very male-orientated culture of honor, culture of pride.
Yeah.
And so many of the heroines of the love songs, and of course the victims of the murder ballads, are these women. And that's something I find so interesting about the murder ballads, because that that culture of honor is still very prevalent in the American South. In fact, it has affected America's many aspects of what America is today. A couple of years ago, I interviewed a number of women at a domestic abuse shelter, and I wanted to sort of, I'd done a couple of the Murder Ballad museum shows, and I wanted to speak to people and get a real life view of it, and it very much validated the themes in those songs. Yes,
what a great thing to do.
That still informs quite a few of the new murder ballad paintings.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, they're now more symbolic. Obviously, with those interviews, the deal was to maintain the anonymity of the interviewees. So,
cool.
So very symbolic paintings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So picking this up, here you are in your mid-20s, and you're coping with the grief of losing your father to a suicide, which is devastating, and you've made your way to America, and I'm just hearing so many interesting elements. It sounds like such an English story. Right. Particularly English, with the strong history of the British Empire and your family's connection to the British military and in all its power and might, and the good and bad, that comes along with war and all that pressure that your father felt from his father. And you see England changing. The British Empire is beginning to crumble worldwide, the 20th century. And it's shrinking, and England's place in the world is changing, and the whole country's in existential crisis for a long time.
Right.
And your family's coming through this.
Yeah.
And here you are as a young man inheriting all this history and backstory, and I find it very interesting that you felt that and you went with it, and it led you to America, to a space with a little breathing room away from the most particular English aspects of it, and yet it still allowed you to be yourself and to grieve as you were productive in your art. And, that process of grieving must have come through the art. And, at some point it's going to come through in something like a murder ballad.
Yeah, I think...
So it's interesting for me to hear how painting murder ballads can be healing, can bring a sense of acceptance of these powerful and dramatic stories that our human lives have lived and, are on full display. And especially when it's in your own personal life. I mean, that's really what's going to drive it is, coping with the loss of a suicide, and then, getting to the point of accepting that these powerful stories shape our life for many, many years. I mean, shape the core of our character, and we just have to continue to work through it. And art can be the creative outlet that allows us to grieve and to alchemize these emotions.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it provides that catharsis.
Yeah.
And
were you able to feel that you were in the midst of this, like, this art is just helping me keep it going, get one day to the next, or was it just happening?
I think it's just a natural thing that, what I experience and what I encounter in life, it is processed by my art. And that's one reason I paint so many different things. I will, if I go for a walk and discover something, I'll paint that. If I see a flower, some flowers in an old pot, I'll paint that. I'll paint my child. The music is so close to me. Those stories, absolutely.
And what's interesting about your work, amongst other things, is like if I'm just imagining if you're painting the flowers in the old pot, you're going to perhaps paint the actual flowers, the buds themselves and their splendor, but you may also include the soil that gets strewn away from the pot and all the incidental artifacts that are all around it.
I certainly focus on the beauty generally. I focus on the beauty in the unexpected, finding beauty in things that most people consider nondescript or even ugly.
Yeah.
That's certainly a very big part of my work.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a connection, and I think the ballads are this connection. I mean, it's very intriguing to me, this thing of storytelling through that music. It's such a connection to my father, and it's very strange. It's particularly recently, a couple of years ago. I've just turned 50, and my father was 47 when he killed himself. And so now, for so many years, he was the sort of ghost in my life that I would, chat to or check in on. And now, suddenly, he's a younger man than myself, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
So I'll be listening to some music now up in Madison County, and I'll think of my father just sitting there, and suddenly I'm older than him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's got to be a strange sensation.
It is. I have this strange image of, I don't know if I believe in heaven in the sort of fundamentalist sense, but of seeing him in the afterlife and the oddness of seeing this rather apologetic young man walking up to me. It's strange.
Wow. Yeah, what a connection. I mean, that transcends age and lineage and all that, and it's just kind of all there together in one moment. And time is all squished down like that.
Yeah.
Interesting. So as you are painting these, as you're establishing yourself as a painter, with a particular subject matter of the American South and the Southern Gothic, or the dark sides of the South,
right,
as well as the light sides, the fullness of it all. In these works that you were painting, did you ever feel like, my dad, he would have liked this one, or he would have been proud of me for this one? This is it.
Yes, certainly. I think particularly with the music, he would have loved this.
The murder ballads aspect
absolutely,
of it. Yeah. Uh-huh.
One thing that's interesting is he was always, I think he was more interested in the West, in the Southwest. And that's probably because he'd grown up on Westerns and things.
Yeah.
And recently, a gallery in Santa Fe has expressed considerable interest in the murder ballads. And so they are now representing that work. And
cool.
So I took a long trip through West Texas and up into New Mexico, exploring that history.
But that's interesting that in painting this and in representing the visuals that we see that are just around us, it encompasses a full history. And you're able to feel that and feel your participation in it. And does it feel like a sense of relief when you're done with a work, when you're done with a painting? And how does it feel when you've gotten it out there just like you'd like it to be?
Well, the thing is, again, I feel, I don't know, with the paintings, and particularly with the narrative paintings, I feel that I get an image in my head, and I get it down, and it's at that point it's gone, and I'm already thinking about the next image.
Once you're done painting it?
Once I'm done painting it.
Okay.
So once it's done and it's left the studio, it's sort of the child that's been born and has gone, has left the nest.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, in the case of the murder ballads, I still have the vast majority of the paintings because they're part of this traveling show. But my mind is always on the next painting.
Well, that's a blessing.
Yes, yeah.
To be able to have more work in the future and to be in that.
So I'm still, it's always in process. It's the way I paint them is evolving all the time. And I don't know, I have more work than I could possibly do. If I was to live another 50 years, I've got so many ideas that are on the back burner. Yeah.
So when people interact with your art and come up to you at shows or when they reach out to you about some of your works, do you get good stories from your audience?
I do, yes.
Yeah.
I do. That's wonderful, and it's almost surprising. As I say, I do the work for myself.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful to realize that it really speaks to people.
Yeah, like how so? What kind of?
I remember a lady in Augusta, Georgia, who was a docent at the Morris Museum, and she was an elderly lady, and she would come and look at the murder ballads when they were on show there, and she said that they pulled the marrow from her chest, which I thought was fantastic. She just loved them.
Yeah.
And to speak to someone who, was 80 years old.
Yeah.
And to have that reaction was just fantastic.
Yeah.
But it's,
It's cool.
My connection is, as I say, it goes back to my childhood and listening to that music.
Well, it's interesting because, you say that that's when you feel you paint for yourself.
Right.
That feels like your authentic form of expression. It feels like it's naturally what calls to you, And yet, when you're being most authentic to yourself, when you're being the most personal and perhaps selfish, is when other folks can connect to it. And it, maybe it's surprising, that this 80-year-old woman feels it in her marrow, but she's able to connect to something that was so personal and authentic for yourself. So that's interesting. Just the nature of art.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's a great gift. It really is. As I say, to have been able to just have this connection so that everything I experience that strikes me deeply, this thing is created from that.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary gift. When you think about this is I think what most people find in parenthood is this sense of, you're here and you've created this
child.
This child that will live after you.
Yeah.
That you've mattered. And an artist, it's obviously, it's not as remarkable as having a child, but each painting is this thing that lives after you.
Yeah.
And it's
like this podcast.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing.
Yeah. Back to the theme of healing and the process of healing and becoming whole from our wounds and our injuries. And we were talking about the chronic wear and tear of pressure and self-criticism and the burden of having to prove oneself, which is, part of our humanity, but ultimately we want to be able to work with it rather than it overpowering us,
right.
Like in a suicide, perhaps. How is your process of working with the inner critic, with that sense of self-criticism at this point? What have you seen over the years with that?
Well, I'm certainly very critical of myself as an artist, but in that realm, I feel
technically, is that what you?
I don't know if it's technique. I'm striving always for
to make a statement and relevance.
Yeah, I obviously I set myself very high standards. So
Yeah.
everything is a step. I at least have the confidence to keep saying, well, the next one will be better. I think a mistake has been in my life is to not have recognized that this being an artist, which I had from the beginning of my life, this gift, that I didn't. In periods of my life, I've let myself be very self-critical of how I am perceived by others in other ways, and I think in that respect that goes back to this issue of competing with my father, which I sort of inherited from him, competing with his father. And that's where I've sort of fallen off the path. Is when I say to myself, "Oh, you should have been a musician like he was," or "You should have been, you should be climbing mountains," or whatever. Those are the times that I've been, self-critical and confused, and So it's a great. I think what's very good about having a child now is to pay attention to not passing that on to him.
Yeah.
And to recognize that I have quite enough. I've been blessed with this talent and an ability, as I say, to somehow make my impression of life very permanent. These paintings exist. I can walk into a room and see a painting of mine that I did 20 years ago, and I can remember what I might have been listening to, the music I might have been listening to when I was painting that. I can, it's a very strong connection.
Do you ever want to take it back?
No, sometimes I wish it hadn't. I wish they could get rid of it. That's for sure. But
do you ever want to touch it up? I just watched The People versus George Lucas last night.
Right,
because that's an ailment.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Do you ever get struck by that bug of?
I do. That's a very good reason to get paintings out of the studio.
Yeah.
It really is, because invariably, when you come back to an old painting and you try and fix it, the whole thing can go wrong.
Yeah.
And I recently had a painting for many years, a large portrait that I tried to adjust, and it got worse and worse, and I had to throw it away. And everyone was, shaking their heads. That's because it had been in the studio for too long. I kept looking at it, and it kept bothering me.
Yeah.
So I've learned to just leave, good enough alone and move on to the next thing. Take that energy.
Yeah.
Move on to something else.
Yeah, that's good. Keep it manageable.
Yeah.
So the white whale doesn't.
That's right. Absolutely.
Tip your ship.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Just the nature of art and our relationship to it and the process of letting go with it.
Right.
Yeah. And then how it leaves us.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you feel like in your process as a painter? Like, I know that's a difficult question, but do you feel like you're in a state of process, that the art is working through you and coming out, and things are moving along with an inertia, maybe a momentum? Yes,
I think. That's a very interesting question. I think recently it's all sort of come together. I've realized, what things I would like to paint. I've noticed traveling around that a lot of art seems to be, it's I don't know. I went up to Maine and this summer, and I felt a lot of art, people were just doing what they were used to, or what they felt would sell. And I was guilty of that myself. And I thought, I really need to paint only, to don't try and second guess the market, to paint only what I want to paint and put all my heart into that. So I've focused a lot on very particular aspects of the landscape that continue to move me. For example, I'm doing an ongoing series. I've painted hundreds of waterfalls in western North Carolina. And
I've seen some of these.
that is something that I find so evocative, particularly in the winter or in fog, and very in the tradition of the romantic landscape. So I'm very excited about that. And another thing is looking at my little boy, I'm realizing that, I enjoy telling him stories. He asks for stories all the time. Some of the ones he asks for are a bit difficult. He's
of course, yeah.
He's very interested in Curious George at the moment.
Yeah.
But he wants Curious George to be a superhero.
Okay,
And,
right.
I find those stories a bit exhausting. But I do like to tell him. I try and throw in one or two stories. Things that I'm painting.
Yeah.
And explain those to him. In fact, recently we both sat down and both interpreted the same story, the story of Demopolis, of the French settlers, and he drew the same character I was drawing. So it just occurs to me, I have all these stories, different narrative themes, not just the murder ballads.
Yeah.
Quite a lot to do with American history.
Okay.
And it occurs to me that I should just paint these stories, and I can tell him these stories as I paint them. But that is something that my father passed on to me. That very strong thing of history and of telling stories, and it's integral to my work. It's odd to look back at my time in art school. For years, I thought that what I was told, the work is peculiar and, really probably something to be avoided in my art career.
What was to be avoided?
This thing of painting. I was doing a degree in printmaking and painting.
Okay, yeah.
And I was mainly focusing on these odd stories.
Yeah.
And that's because they were just so much a part of my growing up.
Yeah.
And I think I was advised, that this wasn't the best career choice. And so I did move towards that realism, and painting the South. But I kept away from this narrative thread. And I could tell that it's something I should do just by the amount of ideas I have, and that I cannot exhaust. I can start a series, and within a few days I've read something, or something else, or something has come back to my memory that is the next series. And that's something I do want to pass on to my son, is that thing of telling stories, and, it's fascinating. I'm doing a painting at the moment. Someone asked me to do a painting for a show that the paintings would involve text. Now, I don't normally write. I have text on my canvases, unless it's some old billboard or something peculiar like that. But there was a story that fascinated me about the Franklin expedition, which was a Victorian expedition to find the Northwest Passage. And that expedition disappeared. They sent many ships after to find out what had happened. It was a huge mystery in the 1840s and 50s. And what I read as a child I don't know if you recall those old Time Life books.
Oh yeah.
Do you remember the one? There was one called the Arctic or the Poles. I'd read a little thing when I was a kid.
I've got a couple of them on the shelf here. I was looking at Earth's Mysterious Places is the one I got.
Right, yeah. So I had one on the poles, and there was a thing there about how Franklin's ships were found based on a father in Dublin. His little girl had died, and her ghost had come back and drawn a map on the wall for her siblings. And the children had told the father that the sister, Wheezy Copin was her name, had drawn this map. And so the father sent the information to Lady Franklin, who had been financing all these expeditions to find her husband, And the last expedition, she based on that map, and that was the map where they discovered the ships.
Wow.
The crew had all died, it had been a terrible tragedy. But so I was fascinated in this ghost, and why on earth a little girl in Dublin would know anything about the Franklin expedition.
Oh, yeah.
So as I say, I've just started a painting, and in fact, in this painting, my son is actually, the bottom part of the canvas is drawn by him, of his idea of two ships in the ice and figures walking, and so we're working on the canvas together. So I want to get him excited in these extraordinary stories.
Oh, that's so cool to hear that. Man, what a fascinating thing to be involved with.
Yeah.
Fascinating story there. And it's so cool to hear that you're involving your son in your work in a way that feels healthy.
Yeah. I think it's that's it's part of who I am, and I think it's part. You choose a profession like being an artist. There's so many ways you can go.
Yeah,
and whether intentionally or not, I mean, you choose one path, it means you're suppressing another.
Yeah,
and I don't know. I think turning 50, I just feel it's I'm just going to paint whatever I want. It's odd that at this point in my life, I'm taking the same risks I took when I was in my early 20s.
Uh-huh.
It's odd. I should be very nervous. I should be thinking, oh my God, the art world is still not really recovered from the recession. A lot of it hasn't. But instead, I'm painting like someone who just, doesn't care about any risks at all.
Yeah. Do you find that your audience is responding to that?
I think people love the work. They love the ballads. The problem with this sort of narrative work is it's extremely difficult for most people to place. Most art is still purchased for decoration, for decor.
Yep.
And any painting with, any painting that might be disconcerting or too mysterious, I think very difficult to place. So
yeah.
I think, but what I notice is the response.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important. I mean, I think the landscapes have affected people, but it's wonderful to see how deeply affected people are by these large paintings with figures and with a narrative taking place. It speaks to people much, much more.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's a faith in that it's going to work out. And I'm glad to hear that you're trusting, you found that the lesson is trusting your inner self, your inner artist, as in that drive and trusting that process is going to work out. There's a lot of courage involved with that.
But this is the funny thing, isn't it? I think this is an interesting thing about courage.
Yeah.
Is that we're most courageous in those things that, there are just areas where we're not filled with fear. We don't have trepidation.
Yeah.
And I think people who would be fearful, they always say, oh, well, that person is being very courageous. But very often it's not. It's just that there's a block there. You see this, I was talking to someone about pilots in Vietnam.
Okay.
And these fighter pilots had the same block. It's just they couldn't really imagine being shot down. Even though every day it was happening to their friends, they were thinking, well, that's not going to happen to me because I'm thinking faster than the other guy. It's just not going to happen. Or you see it with people, like I say, people climbing mountains or whatever it is. We have areas where, for whatever reason, we just don't we just have a sort of mental block about the risks.
Yep.
And I find it fascinating because it's returned to me. As I say, for 20 years or so painting in America, I was very aware, the importance of, selling paintings, making a living. And some weird thing has switched off in my head where I can just go into the studio. There's still a part of me that will do a large waterfall or something.
Yeah.
And know that has a likelihood of selling. But I can go into the studio for days on end and work on something with just no expectation of it selling. For example, this painting of the Franklin expedition. I fully expect to get that back, and I'll just put it away. And in fact, I don't want it to sell because it's got Finn's work on it as well. So,
right.
So I don't know what happened there. Maybe it's a sort of midlife crisis or something. But I just thought, well, I'm just going to paint now as though I just won the lottery.
Well, there's just a surrender to the process that it sounds like takes place, and a trust and a faith, and just keeping going with it.
Yeah.
Because when you finish that one, you may be on to the next waterfall or the next murder ballad or whichever way you're being drawn in that particular moment. Yeah. And I think I speak for the art appreciators to say that we're thankful for artists taking these risks and trusting this intuition and this guide to their process, because I think our whole culture really benefits from that approach. Yeah. And I thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk with me, because visual art is one of those things that a picture is worth 1,000 words, of course, and we don't have 1,000 words for every picture, and we wouldn't even get it. But I really appreciate you putting that process into words, because I think these types of experiences of working through grief and pain and trusting the process are relevant to all of us, not just painters. And I really appreciate what you shared today. Well, thank you very much. It's been delightful. I did want to inform the listener about how to get in touch with your work. What's the easiest way? The best way would be my website, which is julyandavis.com, Julyan Davis.com. Yep. And yes, I think that's the best way. Yeah. That has links to everything else. Yeah, and I'm looking here at your website now, and you've got a lot of your works here, and they're just beautiful in all senses of the word, the dark and the light. And I really appreciate what you shared about working with the dark side and the therapeutic value that can come about that appropriate and thoughtful work. There's a healing in that. I think so, yeah. Well, Julyan, it's a beautiful day we got. It's right at 12 noon now. So I'm going to let you go so you can get on with your day and back to your work. All right. All right. Well, thanks again. Thank you so much. All right. All right. Well, that's it. My conversation with Julyan Davis, the painter and artist. Murder Ballads is his current series. So check out his artwork at julyandavis.com. And thanks to Julyan for taking the time to speak with me and to share with us his story, a portion of his story. I really appreciate that. And thanks to you for tuning in to Anecdotal Evidence. The podcast just continues to evolve and grow. Really looking forward to some of these episodes that are coming up. Got some exciting opportunities, have had some really great conversations that are in the can and I'm looking to share with you. And I've got some exciting opportunities coming up. I'm going to be going to India in just a few weeks, and I'm going to be sharing with you some of my experiences there, hopefully. It's going to be a learning trip, and I hope to record at least one episode of the podcast in India. So I'm really looking forward to that experience and sharing that with you. And again, got some other great conversations coming up. So thanks to you for tuning in. Anecdotal Evidence, we're on YouTube. Podcasts home on the web is at danieljohnsonmd.com/podcast. We're also on iTunes, so feel free to subscribe to us and send me an email, anecdotalevidence@danieljohnsonmd.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast or just have some feedback or ideas, I'd love to hear from you. So thanks again. Appreciate you tuning in. Until next time, this is Daniel Johnson, MD. Take care.